Okay, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Isaac Kato, and I'm the managing director of the Filecoin Techstars Accelerator. I'm a serial entrepreneur as well as a longtime investor. I have started two companies. I've run three of them. I've had three good exits. So I've seen the 0 to 1 journey a number of times. I've also been a venture capitalist for about 10 years and a longtime angel investor. I am super excited to announce that we are spinning up the brand new Filecoin Techstars Accelerator, which will run from March 21st through June 16th in 2022. If you don't know, Techstars is the global network that helps founders succeed, and ultimately we do it really, really well. Collectively, our founder alums have raised well over $15 billion. They include 15 unicorns and have a collective market cap of $52 billion. But notably, of the roughly 2,700 companies that have gone through our accelerators, 85% of them have either exited or are still in business. We really help our companies find success. And in the blockchain and decentralized crypto space, our alums include notable companies like Chain Analysis, TradingView, and Arweave. And my own personal crypto story starts in 2013 when a company I had founded, Vern Global, which actually just got acquired for a bunch of money last week. I brought the first Bitcoin miners to Iceland, and for a brief moment in time, we estimated that we had roughly 5% of the global mining capacity in our data center, our green data center in Iceland. So I've been following the space for a while, and I'm super excited to be working with the folks at Protocol Labs to do a blockchain and Filecoin specific accelerator. And applications have just opened, by the way, last week. So if you're interested, I encourage you to apply. But let's get to the topic at hand today. I am very fortunate to have with me one of the members of Protocol Labs, Jonathan Victor. Jonathan is the NFT lead at Protocol Labs, and he oversees a bunch of product management and business development efforts in and around the NFT space. And we'll have a little chat today and talk about what's going on with Filecoin and NFTs and Web3. So, Jonathan, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about your personal background.
Yeah, thanks for the intro. So I joined Protocol Labs a little over 2.5 years ago. Prior to Web3, I was working across a bunch of different industries. I worked in finance for a little bit. I worked for Palantir, which is a big data tech company. I ended up working across a bunch of different industries, just hopping around between oil and gas, airline manufacturing, airlines themselves, pharma, insurance, just started bouncing around trying to get as much experience as I could. Protocol Labs, I actually first heard of IPFS and Filecoin way back in 2016 during the first big Ethereum run up. I was following Ethereum and I had a bunch of friends in the space. And I knew it was interesting. I just couldn't tell how it was going to be useful. So I was listening to as many talks as I could. I was reading as many white papers as I could. And that's when I actually first came across IPFS. So while Ethereum took a little bit longer for me to truly wrap my head around, what are all the ways that this could be used, IPFS felt much more immediate and a lot more tangible to me. Why do we need to decentralize the internet? What would reimagining things in a peer-to-peer context actually enable? And that was sort of like the seed. And so since then, was following since 2016 up until 2019, hit a point in my career where it made sense, joined as what's called a startup operator. Really, it's just I wear a lot of different hats, bounced around from our research team, helping launch the Filecoin proofs in advance of the Filecoin launch, to hopping into our product team and helping out on our ecosystem team as well. That's the very quick version.
Awesome. So I think many people here will have heard of Filecoin and IPFS and Protocol Labs, but may not kind of have a full sense of the awesome mission and effort and history of this incredible ecosystem. Could you give us a quick sort of rundown of how this all came to be and what was the driving mission? What was Juan's driving mission, and kind of give us at least a summary evolution of IPFS and Filecoin, and then kind of where things stand today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's important for us to sort of frame the problem with how does the internet work today? When you or I are going to google.com, at the front of that, you'll see HTTPS. And that's actually saying, hey, I'm going to like, it's called location-based addressing, but really when you put in that URL, it's mapping to an IP address, you'll get bounced around, but you're going to a specific location to pick up that data. And when you think about how the internet was first originally thought of, it was actually designed to be much more peer-to-peer, but over time, certain trade-offs were made, and we ended up orienting around a more location-based model. And that's led to a lot of benefits. If you think of the evolution from Web 1 to Web 2, location-based models have enabled things like social media platforms to spring up. It allows for much more powerful like cloud computing. But when you think of the trade-offs, although they're subtle, a lot of them end up being around power and like where does it live? What sort of choices do you as an application developer have about porting away from one service provider? And the impetus for IPFS was really trying to reimagine how do we get back to a peer-to-peer internet? So the big twist of what IPFS does versus a normal standard like location-based addressing is to instead index content and reference content by a fingerprint of the content itself. So unlike saying, if I'm trying to go to google.com, instead of like typing in a URL that will resolve to some machine somewhere owned by Google, instead with IPFS, what you do is you request a specific fingerprint of a piece of data, and you just ask the network to say, hey, who has a copy of this thing? And so long as there's a pathway to that content, it'll get served back to you. And so that little twist is actually subtle, but super important because it enables a bunch of interesting properties. So you think about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico got hit by a hurricane in like 2017 or so. And there were news stories about Google having to like try to fly satellite balloons to beam down 2G speeds in order to get content and get access back to the network. But when you think about it from like first principles, it's kind of silly that you have all of this infrastructure that lives locally, but because the content isn't actually located on the island itself, you have to have these bridges in order to pass information back and forth. In a peer-to-peer network, you have a completely severable network. So you could say, hey, I may lose connections to some of these peers, but I should still be able to operate with whatever is like locally dialable. So that's important property number one. And when you start thinking about places that are what's the right term here? Maybe a little bit more restrictive. You think of like India turning off the internet in Kashmir. Turkey has a ban on Wikipedia. China has the Great Firewall. When you start thinking from first principles, there's like certain questions where you might start asking like, what should technology enable by default, and what should be implicit in the like architectural decisions? So as we were building IPFS, there was many sub problems that sort of come out of there. And the way that we design our protocols is we want things to be modular and reusable. Everything Protocol Labs builds is open source. And so when we're starting to build like the networking stack, it became super obvious that peer-to-peer networking, while very important for IPFS, is useful in other contexts. So you look at like ETH2, you look at like Polkadot, these are other teams that could also use the same technology. So we broke out libp2p and made it its own protocol. And so the last component to this is maybe to quickly focus on Filecoin. IPFS offers a specific guarantee where if you have a piece of content that's already advertised on the network and someone else makes a request for it, so long as there's a pathway to it, that content can be served back. It solves this 1 to n problem that says, so long as there is between 1 and n copies of the data that you're looking for on the network, it should be servable back to you. It doesn't solve the 0 to 1 problem, which says, hey, how do I know this content even exists? Especially in a peer-to-peer network, you don't necessarily have the same guarantees. And so this is where Filecoin comes in at a protocol level. Filecoin is a peer-to-peer marketplace where you can contract someone to pay for storage. That provider has to put up some economic stake. They have to provide proofs that they're holding on to the data that, one, the unique data that you sent them, and two, the data is being preserved over time. And between those two proofs, you can actually get programmatic guarantees around the existence of that data. And we start thinking about how do you build these things to be truly autonomous. So if you want to be able to say, hey, I'm both going to enable this contract to store data, and I want to know that there's always at least 6 copies on the network and they're stored across different geographies, those proofs become really important to make sure that you're actually able to make those statements with some sort of like knowledge. And then you can combine that with IPFS to say, if I know that I have different copies of this data that are distributed around the world, I can guarantee that I'm able to actually make this retrieval request and have someone be able to serve the content back. So really, all of these are sort of building as different layers of a part of like the same overarching vision. Really, all of this really stems from the IPFS side, where it's like, when you do this content addressing, you start realizing there's 1,000 different layers to this onion that can be broken out and be reused elsewhere. And that's sort of how we got to IPFS and Filecoin as two complementary protocols that sort of help hand in hand.
Yeah, amazing. Now, if you, so obviously you start with the first principles of IPFS and Filecoin around decentralization and you go there, but when you start to pull on that thread from a very tangible and practical standpoint, there are some pretty major advantages that Filecoin and IPFS offer in storage around immutability, around some cost implications. Can you talk about some of the value prop that Filecoin offers people who are building decentralized apps or any kind of Web3 thing, tools, infrastructure, whatever, that they wouldn't get from a traditional sort of Amazon or Google storage cloud?
Yeah, I think there's three properties that maybe I'll highlight. So the first is this notion of content addressability. As you sort of touched on, this also enables like immutable references. So if you want to reference a piece of content, there is a way of verifiably doing so, where even if you're a client, if you get back some content, you can check to see if it was the thing you actually thought you were asking for. So from that, that's like one very specific thing that actually has interesting implications when you start thinking about like CDNs and like better caching. So from a technical side, that can also improve performance. So mutability is like one important component. Important component number two is cost. Filecoin has 10 MB of storage. It's growing extremely rapidly. This is kind of the power of blockchains where you can create incentive mechanisms that can help create and incentivize actions that you sort of want to exist. In Filecoin's case, it incentivizes hyper cheap storage. Right now, it is, I think it's something close to like 1/1000th the cost of storing on S3 to store things on Filecoin. So when you start thinking about like public good data sets, when you start thinking about like storage at very large scales, it's just incredibly cheap to store on Filecoin compared to like traditional alternatives. And then the last bit, which sort of goes hand in hand with this content addressability, is the portability side, where when you're using something like IPFS or you're building on Filecoin, everything in that market speaks the same language. Whether you store with one provider or in the future you decide to switch to another, your application doesn't need to change. Like you can still be referencing IPFS : your content ID. And if under the hood all of this stuff is being moved around to optimize on costs, it doesn't break what's happening in the front end. I think that's like the last important technical side of this. Yeah.
That's, there's so many, there must be now hundreds, if not thousands of developer or of companies and projects developing on the back of IPS and Filecoin. On the immutability point, I think some of these heritage projects, which are just stunning. I don't know if you want to talk about some concrete examples of how people are taking advantage of, like in particular, the immutability principle. I just think it's so fascinating.
Yeah, of course. So I think we're seeing, two on the immutability side, we're seeing a lot of interest from folks who are doing things in the archiving space. So there's a project called the USC Shoah Foundation. They basically preserve evidence of genocide. They do video testimonies. There's testimonies, obviously, people who are trying to deny like acts of genocide or other like perfect things. They will want to say like, oh, no, this has been altered, doctored, whatever. Filecoin offers a really interesting answer to that, where you both know when the video is created, what is that CID of the content, as well as here's a way of proving that this thing hasn't been modified over time and is intact. And so you get both sides of that. The other actually is the Internet Archive. When we start thinking about like who has large amounts of data, the Internet Archive ends up being the backstop for many nonprofits. If you look at like data repositories and so on. So we're actually working with the Internet Archive to start moving parts of their archive onto Filecoin to take advantage of the super cheap storage costs. Right now, it's a nonprofit. It is basically funded by Brewster. But when you start thinking about how do you make sustainable models that can actually empower not just one organization, but truly, hopefully, all of us, by all of us, not just America, like humanity, I think that's where like incentive design really comes in to create scalable systems.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, it's almost it's a way to preserve truth that heretofore was not quite available, and always relied on a central authority, among other things. But some of the heritage preservation stuff that's going on Filecoin is really amazing. I encourage people to take a look at it. Okay, so well, we're here today to talk about NFTs. Everyone's talking about NFTs. It is quite the rage. I think most people here probably have a general sense of what an NFT is, but just in case, maybe Jonathan, you could give us a quick primer on what is a non-fungible token, and what are these things, and then maybe we can get into where you think it's headed. But what's an NFT?
Great question.
Why do I care?
So an NFT well, technically, there are two different standards that exist, not just on Ethereum, but that's where they started, and they've been now replicated on many other blockchains. But it's really just a standard of creating a token and linking it to some additional metadata. So when you have an NFT, if you look at like on Etherscan or any of these blockchains, what you'll see is it's literally like a contract to mint a token plus some URL that points to some metadata that describes what that token actually should represent in the real world. That second piece of metadata could be anything. It could be an image, it could be a legal document, it could be an AR or VR asset. Literally, it can be anything. And so what's interesting is you've seen, especially in the last year, sort of like a huge explosion in the ways in which people have thought about how to use that very fundamental technology of creating an on-chain anchor to off-chain assets. So that's the very quick version. I think the cool applications that I think we've sort of seen, art was a really big one. And especially when you start thinking about digital artists and thinking about digital scarcity and how to do that in a real way. Blockchains have this unique property where there is a digital source of truth, which just doesn't exist in like the digital space unless you trust a specific institution, which of course then leads to difficulty about like how do you make that portable across different systems. So blockchains as this like public infrastructure, as this ledger of truth, enable digital scarcity, which enables all of these NFT use cases, including a whole class of art that just previously was not monetizable. I spoke with someone who happened to have a floppy disk that contains some digital art created by a very famous artist, and that artist's other work goes for like millions of dollars. But because it's digital art, that floppy disk, when he tried to auction it off like 5 years ago, no one would buy it because it just, I mean, yeah, it's like cool, but like, what's the value of digital art? And I think this year has been like the step change of like digital art has value. There is a way to create and support artists that are creating actual work because we have this provenance mechanism. The other interesting things that we're seeing inside of the NFT space, I think you're seeing many more utility NFTs. This idea that like, how do you better create like infrastructure for things like ticketing? NFTs, because they're built on blockchains, give you the ability to write logic behind the NFTs themselves. So if you want to create a ticketing platform where if someone tries to scalp the ticket and resell it, all the proceeds go back to the creator, you've completely re-incentivized what does it mean to buy a ticket to this event? Is there any actual value in the like a scalper trying to like arbitrage on fan enjoyment? You hopefully can create a much better experience for fans just by taking that incentive entirely away. We're seeing community NFTs as well, things like the Bored Ape Yacht Club, where communities can like find each other online, they can create their own culture, they can use it as like a signaling mechanism. And then most interestingly to me at least is like the intersection of like, people call it like the metaverse, but looking at like NFTs plus all of this DeFi stuff, and then tying that to gaming, where you see like all of these different trends that have separately had their own waves being pulled together into like one massive trend of what does it mean to build on like gaming economies that are tied to actual like economies, which actually is only really possible when you have all of this public infrastructure in place. But that was a lot to unpack, so maybe I'll pause there.
Well, so I want to put a pin on that because I was on the board of a company called CCP Games, which is the developer publisher of a well-known MMO called EVE Online. And even back in 2016, we were talking about the need and the importance and all the incredible things that would be unlocked if you could really have this true sort of verifiable, unique digital title to any kind of digital asset, be it art or a digital sword or whatever. So I do want to talk about that, but just can we take a step back? So is it fair to say that that the real unlock of an NFT is that it does sort of solve this notion of a unique digital title and entity. Like there is a digital thing, but this is the one that counts. I mean, the big problem with digital art, at least, but one of many, is you can copy it. So what is an NFT? What real world problem does the NFT solve that now opens up all these new markets?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's interesting if you think about like Sotheby's. They've been doing auctions for NFTs. I think they sold like 100 something Bored Ape Yacht Club NFTs for 21 million or something. And so when you think about it, it's kind of silly, like in the sense that all of these things exist on chain. You could do the same sort of sale. There's no need for an auction house. So what is the value Sotheby's is bringing? Well, they're bringing legitimacy. And I think like a lot of NFTs end up being about social consensus because like if I create some digital art that's like a picture, you could take my picture and you could also mint it. But if people know that I have a specific wallet address, is there value to the NFT that you've created that does not come from that same wallet address? And I think this is where like this idea of like creatorship and ownership and provenance ends up being more directly traceable, where it's not possible to falsify and say like you are me. Like you could try, but I could easily use other social proof to show that like this is not a thing that you created. And so I think when we start thinking about like lineage and also even derivative works, because you have this public infrastructure that you can look at, if someone creates a derivative work and somehow that becomes much more popular, I know on TikTok that's like a big thing, especially for dancing. Like when you can show that the original actually came first from a different creator, there's a way of at least showing like who deserves like the spillover effect of like fame for actually being the social creator of this idea. So I think like this public this public database is such a powerful concept. Mostly because otherwise it's just like what is in our collective memory, and this provides us like the technical means to actually embed that in something that we can reference.
Yeah, no, totally. And it does feel to me like we are in the absolute nascency of NFTs. Obviously, it's like ridiculously on fire right now. But I've also seen a fair amount of criticism that there are a lot of things that NFT, at least the current NFT infrastructures, maybe don't necessarily support when it comes to all of the things that fall under the general rubric of title. So certainly we have the verification and the authentication aspects of it, but there's a whole bunch of other things that often go with title around rights management. I have this thing right now, it just points to a space, but what can I do with it? Can I copy it? Can I go publish it and sell it? To your point about derivative works. So what else do you think, if anything, has to be built from an infrastructural standpoint? I probably see 2 pitches a day on people who are talking about improved NFT infrastructures. What do you think needs to be built to continue to make sure that this becomes robust and hardened and ultimately useful for the world in many different applications and realms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think to me, at least, the biggest challenge, and I think there's like many things that will break what currently is thought of in like how we think about rights. And like I think part of the magic of technology is like you have this white space and like laws will exist in like the real world. And so there is a question of like what should be like enforceable just through like our legal proceedings and what should be like enforceable on the blockchain. Um, and so from that perspective, I think there are going to be challenges that I think it'll just have to be worked through. Where I don't know if you're Taylor Swift and like you technically signed away your music rights, like at some point in time, what does it mean for you to mint an NFT of an album? Like, do you have the right to do it? It won't be in any of the contracts because that wasn't a thing. So I think there's just going to be a lot of discussion about what does it mean and what is the value. I think what's interesting is NFTs, because they are from a purely like fundamental thing or like view, like worthless, like they are only valuable because we as a society ascribe them value. Because I believe that because Taylor Swift autographed this thing digitally, that this thing matters. There is this question about, yeah, like even if you stole someone else's art, like can you dictate other people don't value or like, yeah, if she were to sign her own music, like can Universal or whoever like dictate that people don't buy this thing? There's a question, and is it like a new work? So I think there's definitely going to be hard things there. The parts that I would focus on though is I think it also unlocks a lot from the perspective of like artists and being able to like more directly engage with fans and more directly like show or like get support from fans. You can imagine, and we're seeing this on platforms like Audius, like you can have NFTs of your content and you can like share that with your community. And it like creates literally a community that doesn't require like in the classic crypto sense, it doesn't require like middlemen of like labels or whoever else. Like you can use all of the tools that are behind you, whether it be social media to create your own platform, NFTs for fans to be able to signal how early they were to you, or even to directly help fund your work so that you can actually like build your art. I think I view NFTs as a much more like community management tool, and so I personally am like happy with the fact that there's currently not a ton of like very rigid rules, because I don't think we've seen all the experimentation and ways in which NFTs will be used. Like a very concrete thing, you can imagine someone issuing an NFT as like a ticket, and that ticket, like NFT ticket, could be used as like a backstage pass. Like in the future, like, do you want to resell that? Do you want to show that you actually were at some specific concert, like early in someone's career? I think there's like a bunch of questions about like who owns what and like what can be NFTified and like where there are other potential concerns. But I think a lot of this ends up circling back to when the technology itself doesn't enforce like a very rigid view of like how monetization should work and all of this other stuff. It really comes down to like a less extractionary, like if you want to and support these people, you are like voluntarily like committing capital to do that. And I think that's why there was a lot of initial skepticism around the idea of like, can NFTs hold any value? Because people question, like, it's a JPEG. Like, why would you pay money for that? And I think a lot of it is just like a fundamental misunderstanding, both of like social dynamics, but also just like, yeah, well, social dynamics, yeah.
So that's super. Let's double click on that, because that was the question I wanted to ask. Like, as you said, it's only worth what sort of the market and the world decides that something's worth, just like money, whether fiat or crypto, right? But what is it? How do we kind of sort of continue to build trust and faith beyond? I mean, certainly you're talking now about some real applications that have utility beyond just the numismatic or collectible value of a crypto kitty or whatever. But how does trust get established here? Like what I totally am with you. Like this is very much still in the experimentation phase. It's still very much in the, hey, let's figure out what we can do with these. But how if you're wanting to do something around NFTs, how does trust get created? How does a belief that this is something of value get built?
So I think my observations, at least, are it comes from a couple things. So one is I think some tie to like there's this notion in crypto of like everything should sort of be like pseudonymous, but I think this idea that you can tie it to some entity, whether it be your actual like personal identity, whether it be like a digital pseudonymous like version of yourself. Like I do think some of this comes from like who are you as an entity? Are you trustworthy? Like, do people have like, are you a cultural leader in some form? So you take a look at, I don't know if you're familiar with this guy, Lumok. He's like a crypto trader. He's a part of like, yeah, a DeFi fund. He just minted a bunch of NFTs. His fans are all like super eager to have them because they want to change their profile pictures to them. And like, that's a way that you can create value where it's like, you're literally taking social value that you already had and then turning that into a thing that both like strengthens your community and like helps build a stronger relationship. But the other way that you can do it is by like building a, actually, whether it's you or like the community itself, you look at something like the Bored Ape Yacht Club, where being a holder of this group or this token, as more and more like utility is added to it. So they're like working on like merchandise, they're working on all of these other things and trying to turn it into like a brand like Supreme. I don't think that's how they would pitch themselves, but that's my analogy at least. Where it's like, if this becomes a real brand, you being one of the scarce 10,000 holders of this thing, you are in the in group and like it becomes its own little private social club, which yeah, is like a different way of like creating that sort of like value. And then Steph Curry goes and buys one, and now everyone wants to be in the same group as him.
Yeah, totally. I like most things. Reputation is built through through a variety of things, including association and who you're hanging out with. But one of the things I think is so interesting about NFTs, and it's true of sort of tokens to begin with in general, and then NFTs sort of turbocharges, but it does open all kinds of new forms of monetization for people who might historically not have had access to it. One of the fun and really like admirable things that I've seen recently, there's a Techstars alum called Pass It Down, which has historically done software for museums and other heritage institutions to simply make themselves more digitally visible. But they're now adding a whole NFT infrastructure and platform, which will allow these institutions to hopefully thrive and frankly get into a better financial position than they have been historically. Something like 35% of museums are financially strapped, and it's only gotten worse during COVID. So I'm really sort of encouraged by all the new sort of ways of compensating and remunerating and bringing sort of financial stability to people that didn't heretofore exist. I don't know if there are any other examples like that you've come across, but
I mean, one of the cool things, just like charity NFTs in general, I think is just such a fascinating way where like, even just as like a very direct funding model, I've seen a bunch of folks who are trying to do innovations between like NFTs and DeFi, where like there's a DeFi protocol called Charged Particles, which allows you to load money into an NFT. That money can be like lent out to generate interest, and that interest can be used to like pay the charity or whoever. But then with the NFT, like both you have like a bond of like this cash where like if you want to send the NFT back, you can get back your principal, or you can just like hold on to the NFT and use it as a thing to just like showcase your support for this group. But like when you think about it from a funding side, it's just creating these like little revenue streams that add up over time, which is super cool. Of like, how do you basically allow anyone in the truly crypto way, like be your own bank, doing like banking type services in order to generate like donation revenue for these charities.
Yeah, it's awesome. So then let's put on our let's pull out our crystal balls here. I think you've already started to allude to some of it, but look 5 to 10 years out, and there's a lot more infrastructure around NFTs in terms of making them more powerful, providing more sort of utility and application around them. What does the world look like? And I guess I'm thinking specifically, if you open the funnel more broadly to Web3 in general, what does the world look like in terms of all the cool things that start to become enabled?
Yeah. So I see, well, I'll give you two. So in the sports arena, I think two things that seem extremely reasonable and like highly likely to me is this idea of like NFTs as just like attendance and like proving fandom. So like whether you go to an event and like the ticket is like a proof of attendance, whether it be like, I don't know, you go to like a local club or whatever else, I think having these events, which can signify your like fandom for a thing, seems like something that as we increasingly see more and more people go online will become more important. Like if you, and it also makes sense from the perspective of like teams, like if you're the Mavericks and you want to like reward your biggest fans, like how do you know who your biggest fans are? Like NFTs might actually be a really reasonable way of being able to figure out that sort of question. Where there's like a metric of like, here's literally they show up for every game for the last 40 years. Yeah, that's probably in the same way that like a frequent flyer program may reward those like highest flyers, you might want to do the same for those fans. I also think for like streaming, like when you start thinking about like, how do you get more people to participate and engage, like you could reward people who aren't even in the game for like watching the game live. You can imagine like an NBA Top Shot type thing where literally when I was in college, I went to Duke. There was a game against UNC where Austin Rivers had a buzzer beater 3 where we literally won by 1 point and the whole campus went crazy. Like imagine if while watching that game, you had an NFT of that moment that's just dropped as like a digital collectible. Like I think we've already sort of seen that market get validated where like people really like and enjoy having these like digital memorabilia. As you see more and more like metaverse spaces, I think the value of being able to create and like curate those types of spaces will become more important. And then the other direction entirely is just, we were talking a little bit about like EVE Online. I think gaming is already validated. People spend like 300 billion on like skins inside of a game that like can't be transferred elsewhere. And I think there's an interesting flip that NFTs potentially answers that, or ask of that question, which is like between NFTs and DeFi, if this can be connected to other games, what does that mean for the value of the asset itself? And what does it mean for the game itself? I think one of the most interesting experiments in crypto has been like this loot project, where literally, if people aren't familiar, it's just NFTs that are of like words. And the words all look like World of Warcraft style like loot. It's like boots, hammer, like helmet, whatever. And then there's communities that are all building their own games because they've activated a user base. They have 20,000 people who all own these different loot things, which are users that can come play the game, whatever game it might be. And like whether it is like your specific version of a World of Warcraft thing, or you decide to create like a Space Odyssey, like all of those same users can take their NFTs into those games and see whatever version you've painted for them, which I think is totally fascinating. And then tie that to like a resellability thing, and I think there's a lot that's there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the realms that this will open up in and around the virtual world space, games and otherwise, are incredible, because something like EVE Online, it has an amazingly vibrant and large virtual economy. Okay, and I always felt like, so in the game you are a space captain, and I always felt like if you gave the rabid fans of EVE Online a way to actually make a living playing that game, at least a third, if not a half of them would just quit their day jobs right away. And this takes us a major step closer to saying, hey, you can actually manufacture digital assets that you hold title to, that you have the rights to, and you can actually get compensated for them. There are already kludgy ways to do that, but I think NFTs and DeFi take it much more, take it a major level up, and particularly around portability to other systems and tying different virtual worlds together. It's going to be mind-blowing. Okay, so one more question for you, and then I think we're coming close to the end here, but for all the founders out there, where do you think the interesting innovation, just throw out some ideas. I know there are millions of them, but what are some of the interesting opportunities for innovation? Where would you like to see people dedicating their sort of development and entrepreneurial efforts to move this whole ecosystem forward?
Yeah, I think honestly, gaming to me is like one of the places where I'm spending a lot of time looking. I think we are seeing the beginnings of it with things like Axie Infinity, and like for folks to just go look at like Axie's like trajectory. I think coupling that with like AAA style like game studios, plus like there are teams that are already building the separate parts of this puzzle for like really robust like NFT markets as well as like DeFi markets. I think whoever has I think that will be the way that we get like the first billion users onto crypto, is like through games. Just because like we already know games, people like games. So that to me at least is like the most interesting. But I also would give a plug to a lot of the ways that people are tying NFTs to like more, I guess, like traditional like funding models for like artists. I think it tends to end up meaning that you can like use the same tooling between artists, charities, from like a social good perspective. I think there's a lot there. And one of the interesting components of crypto is like working to help support the public good does not have to be a trade-off with like being able to build like a sustainable business, which is where I think, yeah, I would heavily encourage founders to also keep an eye out.
Okay, awesome. Well, I would be, to wrap this up, I'd be remiss in not doing a little plug for the thing that Protocol Labs and Filecoin and Techstars are doing, which is the new Filecoin Techstars Accelerator that I mentioned at the beginning. We would love to see any founders who are building on and around the Filecoin and IPFS storage infrastructure and transport infrastructure to think about applying. It's great for anybody who's got an early stage company playing in the decentralized space. We're a mentorship-driven accelerator where you get the best of all worlds of Techstars, as well as the experts from Protocol Labs and the Filecoin ecosystem to help you on your way. Certainly tons of amazing network opportunities and ultimately investment capital. So if you're interested, please take a look. Just do a search for the Filecoin Techstars Accelerator. It'll quickly pop up, and then I'd love to have a chat with you if you are a founder doing a startup in the space. And with that, I will say, first of all, thank you, Jonathan, so much for sharing your incredible insights and experience in this stunningly vibrant and interesting space. It is the wild west, but in like a really exciting and great way. And I want to also thank our hosts at the Black Blockchain Summit for giving us a chance to talk about NFTs and Web3 and Filecoin. We really appreciate it, and we're happy to be supporting this awesome conference. So thanks everybody for taking the time to hear us today, and hope to see you somewhere out there in the world. Thanks.
Thanks.